Hello everyone. I welcome you to Capgemini and T-Hub's Innovation Coffee Table podcast series, a series of conversations where we have industry leaders and we get their diverse perspectives on everything on innovation. So I am your host Aakash, yours truly Aakash Jaiswal, and my panelists today have been carrying the innovation mantle all throughout their careers spanning decades, if I may add. Without further ado, let me introduce our panelists for you today. We have Bob Schwartz, who is the Global Director of Capgemini's Applied Innovation Exchanges, AIEs, and for our audiences, Capgemini's AIEs is Capgemini's Global Innovation Platforms. And we have Nisheeth Srivastava, who is the Chief Technology and Innovation Officer, India, at Capgemini. I welcome Bob, Nisheeth, welcome you to this podcast, Innovation Coffee Table, and glad and excited to have you here.
Well to be here.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So, before we jump into questions and taking your perspectives, right, I'll just set some context on what is it that we'll be picking your brains today on. When it comes to innovation and the entire spectrum of innovation, we see that there has been intent and there has been passion to follow through that intent across stakeholders. And I think in this journey, what really has come forward is there are two particular set of stakeholders whose collaboration would really make this innovation journey more seamless. And these two stakeholders are corporate enterprises and the startups who are doing great work in innovation. So we'll be picking our panelists' brain on how can startup and corporate enterprise collaboration make innovation journey more seamless, how can it drive innovation. And right off the bat, if I were to ask my first question to Nisheeth, you are someone who has seen the best of both worlds, right? You have been a serial entrepreneur as well as you have worked with enterprises. And so my first question to you is, why should a startup even consider of collaborating with a corporate enterprise? Why should they even do that? From a founder's perspective, if you were thinking along those lines, if you were to don that hat now.
It's a good question. And I just spent some time last week, actually, just 2 days ago, with NSR Cell in an event in IIM Bangalore, where, you could see all of this, taking shape, corporates and enterprise and startups and incubators coming together. But I reflect on my first startup when I did in 2000, just before the bubble burst, right? I was maybe 26, 27 years old then, right? It was just beginning. We didn't even have, the kind of internet access that we have today, right? In India, a few of us created our first email, around the time. The spirit of entrepreneurship and of startups, etc., at the time, was, let me just say, very, very rash. The best of the best would, let's just say, get an inspiration which they don't believe, can be accomplished within the employer at the time. And you would step up, all right, to bring shape to what you believe will change the world.
Sure.
Therefore, you're better than what exists, right? Mm-hmm. And therefore, there was that, at least I had a slightly more, let's say, brash attitude towards, the whole concept of partnership with corporates at the time. And we did spectacularly. But over the years, right, and half my life I've been a startup guy, I've seen how the world has changed, right? The predisposition. See, my business card wouldn't get me into meetings then, when I was a startup guy. As a corporate executive, I could walk into the corridors of the C-suite. But eventually, I started seeing the value of the business card. If you're a startup guy, you began getting invited to these very important meetings. And the equity of the startup world at large, globally, not just in India, was rising and rising very, very fast. Because, collectively, the kind of thought leadership that was being brought to bear, was absolutely astounding, right? So while the enterprises sort of went after scale and predictability and low risk, right? The startups would do everything which is on the other spectrum, about unpredictability, about disrupting what exists. So fundamentally, it's like destroy what's stable. For what? For future relevance, right? And these two dynamics began coming together. All right, so in that journey of nearly 23 years, actually for me now, I've seen the shift. Now, me those many years ago would not have collaborated with enterprises in India. But when I traveled to the US, okay, as that same startup guy, I was meeting the very large corporations and trying to bring them on board because as enterprise clients, I needed them for my very existence, right? It is not just about the venture capital that I needed to get, right? So what was the basis on which I sought out those clients? Because, remember, for a startup, for what it does, focus is absolutely critical. You add corporations that don't align with the bigger vision that the venture capitalists are, putting money behind you, won't take you very far. So we have to select then, and we have to select now the kind of enterprises. Well, I recognize that I almost spoke like a startup guy even today. I'm sorry, that just happens.
That's why we got you around.
Yeah, but the spirit is that you go after the vision that you have and seek out the right partners in the corporate world, those that believe in the philosophy of the very disruption that you are proselytizing, right? And for that reason, going back to the question, okay, the fit, product fit, cultural fit, okay, mutual dignity, and a sincerity of collaboration, which is co-innovation. Those are absolutely critical for one to establish it. And I'm very, very happy to note that all of those things have actually come together, not as one-on-one entities, but using a system of enablers like incubators and accelerators, and even the VC firms, right? They do all this. Plus, the corporates themselves have started creating a lot of these platforms now. So that would be my response. Enabled by a larger ecosystem, right? I find that the startups do want to engage a great deal more with the corporations for scale and predictability, but also for many other things which I can speak about with you.
Thanks, Nisheeth, for spending some time on the common denominators also, right? The startups are looking at while they should be, for example, moving forward, and I'll come to that. We have something that we would want you to expound upon a little later. But let me turn it around for you, Bob.
Sure.
I'm sure when Nisheeth would have been speaking when he was donning the hat of a founder while speaking, you have been on the other side of the table, right? You have been on the corporate enterprise side. Why should a corporate think of, when it comes to innovation, why do you think a corporate should be partnering with a startup? And why do you think a corporate's innovation journey, their innovation ambitions or initiatives, they can get sort of accelerated with this partnership?
Actually, even in the last word you used in the question, accelerate's a good word. Okay, so I think one of the reasons, if we're polarizing the question that way, right? Like, what's in it for the startup? What's in it for the corporate?
Yeah.
Honestly, that thinking, I think, is the best strategy. If it's not a win-win, don't work together. Don't waste each other's time and everything like that. But I do think the benefit for the corporates, like we've worked with a lot of corporates for decades. Thanks a lot. No, but I started working with our applied innovation exchanges in San Francisco. And clearly a startup culture, a prevalence of that capability. It's why we were there and working with corporates about 7 years ago or so. And the benefit to the corporates, to steal a word you used, is you blew right past the word when you said thought leadership. It's like, the fact is, I think, I'm going to list maybe 2 or 3 things. I haven't thought them ahead, so just bear with me. From a corporate point of view, I have access to thought leadership. If I'm working with those startups, I have access to those new thoughts, new ideas, new ways of thinking. So it's access to that thought leadership. Maybe there's a tool, a system, an accelerator, a new way of looking at something. If I'm not accessing that, then I'm missing out. Now, you could say you could access anything. You can read research reports, whatever. But working with a startup, if you think about where we are today, the investment in startups, and I'm not even going to quote a number because I'll be wrong, like 300 billion or whatever. I don't think anybody watching, I forgot we have a camera. Like, I should probably be talking to you guys. If you're watching this, you probably have some interest in innovation, and therefore the concept of startup, you either are one or know one or working with one. It's essentially where all the money is. Okay, so if all that funding is going into, it's essentially a massive research and development department outside of your company that you can access. So it's access to thought leadership, access to things that'll make you move faster. But I'm going to throw two other curveballs in there a little bit that I think that why the corporate should work with the startup. There's a little bit of an influence on culture, okay? If it's too much influence, they're not a fit, right? So it's a balancing act, okay? But that influence of moving fast, being willing to be modular in your solutions, getting that best in breed, doing MVP work, doing, that kind of agile and design thinking type, processes. That's an infusion that helps the culture as well. So sure, I'm after the business value, I'm after the thought leadership, I'm accessing that massive R&D that is out there. So I'm bringing that into my company. That's bringing me value. Okay, if I do it successfully, and there's a lot of challenges in doing it. But I also think there's an infusion just of new thinking, of culture, of the value of teamwork, of sometimes you get that also. I think the last thing I was thinking to mention was it brings you a certain cross-industry dimension sometimes.
Absolutely.
Okay, because sometimes it's the startup that's working with industries outside of yours or countries outside of yours. So it's actually the startup that's going to get that insight into a corporate that's maybe moving into a new market or trying to think of their products in new ways. So it is that different lens, that different way of looking at things. But if I had no other reason, it's just a massive R&D department that someone else is paying for. Why not work with them?
But that's actually brilliantly put, and I really love the way you start off with saying it has to be a win-win for both stakeholders, right? It has to be a win for the corporate enterprise and it has to be a win for the startup to collaborate. They're not here to do charity. Well, in most cases, they are. But Nisheeth, if I were to take a straw from what Bob mentioned, then do you think there's a conflict of interest also that startup founders and also corporate enterprises would be wary of, let's say, IP infringements, their own intellectual property, their own patent side. So do you think those zones are where there are still fault lines and some creases that needs to be raised?
So, as Bob was putting his response, I got reminded of the sheer numbers of delegations we were hosting. Simply because we were working with these global corporations, there were Fortune 50, many of them, right? One of them, in fact, was a global president of one of the world's largest telco companies, actually, was on our board. He joined our board. I mean, I have very fond memories of the time. I used to live in railroad side motels to economize, $35 a day. Okay, eating in Wendy's because they used to serve such huge proportions that I would eat half and the other half I'd carry. Because that's the only money I had for the day, right? So, I'm going to the guy's ranch in San Diego, okay, cliffside. He owned the cliffside. Okay, so, we were kicking, dirt, okay, and a lot of corporations in India, because it was just brilliant, okay, what we were doing, wanted to collaborate, and they would be in our office almost on a daily basis. It cost us a lot of time. It cost us a lot of energy. They had no intention of collaborating. All they wanted to do was pick on the ideas that we were, and we were happily sharing that, by the way, and they go and deploy that with their corporate clients. Okay, so beyond the point, right? It needs to be collaborative. Yes, there are fault lines. There were fault lines. I think, but many of the startup guys have, made those mistakes and learned from them and know how to steer the conversation so that there is a give, but there is a take also. Right? So, yes, corporations will engage startups because they want that thought leadership, but no, they won't do it today. Okay? It's not a catwalk anymore unless there is something in it for them too. So it has to be a symbiotic relationship at its very core, which is why I mentioned in the previous response that there has to be value for both. And we talked about win-win. The same thing. You have to have a cultural fit, right? If it's just a matter of tracking somebody and gain insights from them, then most of the startups, certainly the ones that are progressing very, very swiftly forward, will not participate in those discussions.
And I think the example that you took, right, that may ring true with a lot of our startup founders who would be watching this episode, and they might want to take a leaf out of it. And Nisheeth, while you were on that, do you also think that when you're talking about symbiotic relationships, how there is a network of accelerators, incubators which have come together to create this ecosystem, do you think the government has a role to play somewhere? Do you think they are, from a stakeholder perspective, they can be someone who can smoothen out this process of collaboration?
They can play a very, very important role. Because look, the infrastructure that's available, the information infrastructure, today is democratized. Sure, everything is on the internet. But, the point is that there's so much depth of very bright ideas, very large scale ideas that unfortunately don't need a tier 1 city to take shape in. There's a tier 2 city, there's a tier 3 town, and village entrepreneurships, right? Entrepreneurs who have the ideas which will change the world at a scale the world's never seen. Because it applies really well to the 1.4 billion people in India.
Sure.
Which that guy in the dusty terrain, right, figured out.
Sure.
Not over here. Now, that guy is challenged for resources, right? So I'm not saying, it's only the access to resources in geographical terrain where the government can play a role. I'm talking about the democratization of the opportunity, to be able to create an ecosystem. So you will find that there's a lot of social infrastructure that has been created, but there's a lot of the commercial one also that has commenced in India. Overseas, you may not have the same dynamics at play, though, right? So in India, again, I'm just speaking for India. The government, under an act of parliament, under which the Indian Institutes of Technology and IIMs and a few other universities in India, they created a mechanism whereby if you work with and collaborate with this academia, the amount of money you spend on corporate social responsibility, a proportion of that money can be used for tax benefits. Okay, and look, it's an investment from the government, because it could have been in the coffers, but it has seriously, I would dare say, given a massive thrust to the IIT, to the corporate and academia dialogue on innovation. Certainly with the IITs and IIMs and those of that ilk, okay, in India. Maybe you can add, your perspectives outside of India.
Yeah, I think, obviously global, it varies, okay? That's a given. Governments vary, globally. You mentioned the democratization. I think the fact that we even have startup is such a big thing globally, meaning it is a way that technology is being developed. You have access to compute power and things like that. Like I mentioned, it's an R&D shop. It's like, why did R&D departments, they still do exist, but why did R&D departments exist in big, giant corporations? Because they could afford them, because they could buy the computer necessary. Well, now that's become much more accessible. It's consumed by the CPU minute. You didn't have to buy a computer center or whatever. So there's many things. There's so much wind at the back of startups that I think a lot of governments are looking at that and saying, how can we use this to bring our citizens up? Okay, so it's employment. It's getting the companies in that country access to the best startups. It's providing funding so that their corporations take advantage of innovation and therefore succeed better and therefore help their citizens, right? So I think it takes different shape. Like in San Francisco and New York, it's very, we have AIEs in those two cities, but in the United States, it's basically just capitalism. I have VCs that want to give me money because they want to make money, and that just thrives. In some of the other countries, France, for instance, our headquartered company. I'm not going to be an expert on public policy, but you see a lot more of the communities of support, more like you described in India, where there's more government sanctioning of accelerators and institutions, and conferences will be at Viva Tech soon and things like that. So a lot of government support, I would say, for that ecosystem approach to business. And I think, and I'm okay with this, for selfish reasons, because they want to help their citizens. And if I offer it and some other country doesn't, probably it's going to come here, right? So it is, I think every government is looking at how do I use this to help my citizens, because it's an opportunity to help both their potential employees, but also the corporations that are working there.
I think that's a great perspective you put in, and what better example that we have at present, right? Even the T-Hub, our partners, they are backed by the government. Government is actively supporting them. And Capgemini and T-Hub, both these entities, they are playing a role in democratizing and enabling this ecosystem which brings in startups and corporates together. So,
if you don't mind, sorry, nothing like interrupting the... I told myself I wouldn't do that, right? Because
no, it hasn't. Take the coffee away.
I was told this was okay because it's a coffee session, right? And I'm having a little trouble with my throat. It hasn't been mentioned yet, but one of the things I'm seeing governments get active in, you mentioned a little bit about intellectual protection, and I'm seeing some government activity there that's helping both the corporations and the startups. But we really haven't deeply mentioned sustainability yet. And that's where I'm seeing governments pushing harder in innovation lately. Sure. Is they're doing things like if you're a startup and you're doing something that we think is responsible or sustainable, it's not always sustainability, but something that's responsible for society or responsible for the planet. Governments are getting behind that. So I'm seeing them kind of leave behind some of the startup focus on just it's a new technology or a faster cell phone or a whatever. And I'm seeing the governments push things that are good for the people or good for the planet. So that I didn't mention that, but I think it's just an evolution of government support, but in a focused way.
So that actually goes on to say that governments have a focus on innovation for good and tech for good, right? Overall societal good. And it has given me an interesting segue to my final questions. We are at the closing minutes of our podcast. Time flew. But so we started off with taking a polarizing view, right? We had startups and we had corporates getting their views. What are the challenges that they face, the common denominators, what they should take care of, and even intellectual property, when it comes to conflict of interest, and how can the government be an enabler to the entire ecosystem. Finally, ending on a note of what is it that we are seeing in terms of outcomes. I'm sure Nisheeth, Bob, both of you, you're in the thick of things when it comes to these collaborations. What is it that you're seeing, those themes where you see corporates and startups collaborating in themes of emerging tech? Sustainability is one of them that Bob just pointed out. What are certain themes where you see these have come out and have created business value, have created greater good for the overall society also? So if you can just give your parting remarks on that.
I'll just connect with the previous question, which Bob also touched upon briefly. Some themes emerge because there's a lot of money behind it. So in European Union, for example, there's a kitty set aside for, let's say, technologies like quantum technologies. And it runs into billions, in research on use cases around engineering principles, aviation, satellite comm, all of that, using quantum technologies. And every country across the European Union, it's a fund, it's a common fund, right? Every country has a role to play there, right? And they're able to then embark on something that's going to be absolutely seminal, will change the game as we know it today. So those are innovations which are driven with a lot of money behind and a lot of participation, therefore, of the entities, because it just makes sense. And then, there's, like he mentioned, sustainability as an example, right? We recently had, a kickoff, what we call the Capgemini India kickoff, annual plans, where I took with me 3 startups, flew them over, and sustainability, very clearly, was one of the big themes, and that company is absolutely rocking the stage globally. There's another one which has created a mechanism to use quantum machine learning on existing hardware to do computations 10 to 15 times faster. So you can imagine if you're doing things like engineering simulations or very high intensity computing, even in financial services or Monte Carlo simulation or whatever that you're running, which takes hours and hours, you could run it in a matter of a few minutes. What that implies is it's not just a compression of time, but the compression of resources. To deliver far more, 10 to 15x. Absolutely. So it's like a bridge into what's the future computing infrastructure. And then somebody who was, another one which is doing a very cool thing around decentralized computing using Ethereum blockchain and stuff like that. changing, by the way, the lives of farmers. Okay, at the grassroots level, tokenizing, the agricultural produce. And you see, I can see similar stuff coming up in education segment.
Mm-hmm.
These are fundamental building blocks of a society. All right, I talked about agriculture, education, right? Smart cities is another area. And look, these are important sectors based on which the society will evolve. The future, of all of us is going to be predicated on. And it's the foresight of these very smart people. And I have great love for entrepreneurs. You can see my voice rise there. Because they just have it in them. The ability to not just spot the opportunity at the time, but the ability to connect it, to what they believe is how the world will shape up. All right, so opportunities and use cases, etc., evolve on that basis. I particularly like the ones that shape humanity at large. ChatGPT, we didn't talk about it, thankfully. I brought it up.
That's kind of amazing. That should be the headline: is we did this and didn't. Yeah.
I'll leave it for you then. Yeah. But I think, that's going to change, not ChatGPT per se, but the whole generative AI technology. And you will find many different versions of the same thing. They're already there, lurking on the horizon. They'll change the very game, And that's topic for another podcast maybe. But yeah, I would say those are the guiding principles, I think, for the future.
Thank you so much, Nisheeth. Bob, over to you.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, if it wasn't this, I'd say drop the mic, but it's attached to our shirts. I think you set it up pretty well. I was trying to think of what I could add that's of any value there, but maybe something I've just been wrestling in my own head a little bit. I think I echo almost everything Nisheeth just said, and I'm actually thinking sometimes, like you asked a lot of questions about corporate and startup.
That's good.
And you asked just now about value, right? Like where are we seeing the value? I can't name any one technology, generative IT or anything else, metaverse or whatever. And I really can't name any one industry or any one business problem. It really is widespread. Okay, so I don't even have a favorite. Okay, but when I think of those two things, and we talked about corporate, it's not all about, and you became a unicorn or it changed some massive thing that we all know and it's a household name now or anything like that. I'm actually seeing a bit of there can be I'll call it a barbell of success. So when you ask me where I'm seeing value, I am seeing corporates get the hang of working with startups and delivering value and at scale. So innovation at scale. It's a big place that Capgemini plays, is helping innovation at scale. Definitely seeing that. It's the right trend. It continues. It accelerates. It's going on in spite of recession pressures or anything else, right? But there's another side that I don't think gets enough voice, and you made me think of it, is there's also so many niches, and these niches are serving people that need to be served or business opportunities that need to be served. And they're actually huge markets. They can be millions and billions of dollars, right? But it's not making a new electric vehicle. It's not that kind of thing. That's still great, and let's do that. But it's helping farmers outfit their existing machinery to do more efficient planting. That's helping the small farmer. Okay, that's not helping, bless their heart, the corporate farmers, the Cargill or whoever, didn't mean to mention anybody. There's, you know what I mean? So I think there's I call it a barbell, because I think I'm seeing lots of value in corporates getting the hang of working with startups and having real impact. And I'm also seeing lots of things that maybe people wouldn't have bothered with 5-10 years ago. They're now addressing those markets, and they're helping people, they're helping sustainability, or they're just creating a whole new market of how are people maybe in a different, a less developed market doing financial transactions. Well, that's a whole new market. How are people doing micro loans? It's a whole new market. So I'm seeing startup value with the corporates, and I'm seeing this whole second, I call it a barbell, because this is huge and this is not, but it's many, many things that are adding up to something huge. So I'm seeing startups playing in those two spaces.
Brilliant. And the sum of its parts is much, much greater than, right? The ultimate addition is much greater than the sum of its parts. So thank you for so beautifully putting in, Nisheeth, about the different areas, your experience with the recent kickoff on the example that you took, decentralized technology, and your examples, Bob, where you talked about certain niche startups.
And with that, we come to the conclusion of the lively discussion that we had today. Thank you so much, Nisheeth and Bob, for sharing your insights and perspectives.